At 6:13 on November 20th, 1943, over the pale green lagoon of Tarawa, a flat-bottomed landing craft slammed to a halt against unseen coral and threw First Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins off his feet. He crashed into the metal gunwale, grabbed for a handhold, and heard the coxswain shout die in his throat as the first Japanese machine guns opened up. Tracers stitched the water in front of the boat, neat horizontal lines that instantly dissolved into splashes, foam, and bodies. They had stopped short, he realized. The reef had caught them. All around, other boats were grinding to a stop, engines roaring uselessly as wooden hulls ground on coral like teeth on bone. The plan was dying in front of his eyes. Hawkins forced himself upright, one gloved hand pressed against the metal to steady his legs against the shudder of the engine. He was 29 years old, newly made an officer after working his way up from enlisted ranks on Guadalcanal, and he looked older. A thin, hawk-nosed Texan from El Paso, he had the permanent squint of a man who had spent too much time in harsh sun and not enough in sleep. The men behind him, his scout sniper platoon, the hand-picked eyes and ears of the 2nd Marine Division, watched his shoulders, waiting to see if they would tense in panic or stay loose. They knew his story, or enough of it. He had once been told he might never walk again after a childhood accident. He had delivered newspapers, worked railroad gangs, clawed his way into college. He had been rejected by one service, then another, before the Marines took him. When others broke, he pushed forward. That was why they were glad he was in front of them now, even with death scything the lagoon. "Reef," the coxswain shouted. "She is stuck, Lieutenant. We are not getting off this." The rest of his sentence vanished in the boom of a shell that landed close, so close that seawater lifted up in a wall, then crashed over the bow, drenching everyone. Hawkins coughed salt and cordite from his lungs and stared past the spray at the low strip of sand that was Betio Island. It did not look like much, a pale curve of beach, a few twisted palms, a low rise crowned with a tangle of wreckage, but he knew better. He had spent the voyage studying grainy reconnaissance photographs and maps spread out in the wardroom, tracing lines of fire with a blunt pencil. That curve of sand was lined with concrete and steel. Every few yards, barely visible even now, were the angled snouts of pillboxes and blockhouses. Behind them, dug into the coral, lurked heavier guns that could split a landing craft and the men inside it like kindling. The air still smelled of naval gunfire, of high explosive and burning oil. The bombardment had gone on for hours, pounding the island with shells from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers until the entire horizon had disappeared behind a wall of smoke. The men on the transport had cheered at every impact, imagining Japanese defenses being pulverized into rubble. Hawkins had not cheered. He knew the Japanese had dug deep, bored their positions into coral and covered them with coconut logs and sand. Big guns could do a lot, but they could not reach men who had vanished underground and waited. He checked his watch, wiped spray from its face, and felt his throat tighten. They were late. The timing between bombardment and landing was everything in an assault like this. Hit too soon and the defenders might still be stunned. Hit too late and they would have had time to climb back into position, shake off the dust, and collect their weapons. The guns on the island were already finding their rhythm. He could hear them now, deeper booms under the rattle of machine guns, and see where their shells fell in fat fountains among the stalled boats. Hawkins turned, crouched low, and met the eyes of his platoon sergeant, a stocky man from Pennsylvania whose name tape read Kowalski. Around them, the men hunched beneath steel helmets, some making nervous jokes, some silent, all listening for their lieutenant. "Reef has us," Hawkins shouted over the noise. "We are not going to float in. We wade from here." A young Marine near the bow swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Sir, that is 500 yards. Maybe more. That is 500 yards of not being killed on this boat," Hawkins said. "Over the side. Keep your heads down. Spread out." "We moved for the pier first." He did not bother to sugarcoat it. There was no cover between the reef and the beach, no trenches, no dunes, not even a line of driftwood. The water was chest deep now, and every man who went over the side would be reduced to a slow, stumbling target, but the alternative was worse. He looked back once toward the transport ships anchored beyond the reef, great gray silhouettes under the morning haze, and thought fleetingly of turning back, of waiting for amphibious tractors that could grind over the reef on steel tracks. Then he saw a boat to their left take a direct hit. It simply vanished. 1 second there was a 36-foot Higgins boat, its bow packed with Marines. The next there was a geyser of water and wood fragments and body parts. Men in the rear of that boat surfaced, screaming, some without arms, some without faces. The machine guns on the island raked them. Hawkins vaulted the gunwale. The lagoon swallowed him to the ribs, the shock of cool water cutting through the hot fog of fear, anger, and noise. His boots slid on coral. He nearly went under, grabbed instinctively at the side of the boat, and then deliberately let go. Behind him, his men followed, splashes and curses and sucked in breath. The boat rocked and lightened, the coxswain still wrestling stubbornly with the throttle, but Hawkins barely heard it. All his attention narrowed to the line of beach ahead and the deadly space in between. He moved forward, hunched low, the weight of his gear turning every step into a slow lurch. The water clung to his webbing, his rifle, the bag of grenades slung at his hip. With every yard closer to shore, it grew shallower, which should have helped. It did not. Shallower water meant less cover. A bullet that missed his head by an inch would now carve a groove in his back. A shell that had been muffled by depth might now explode close enough to suck air from his lungs. Somewhere to his right, a man screamed for his mother, voice high and raw. Someone else shouted a prayer. Hawkins felt both sounds press against him like a physical weight, and he did something he had learned long ago on dark jungle nights. He compartmentalized them. There were shelves inside his mind, places to put fear, pity, guilt. He had failed them over 17 months in the Pacific. He would open them later. Right now, all that mattered was distance. 50 yards from the craft, the first man went down. Hawkins saw water jump around the Marine's chest, as if something had slapped the lagoon. The man jerked once and then simply folded, sinking without a splash. Another took a bullet in the helmet. It spun off his head and vanished, but the kinetic punch snapped his neck. His body stayed upright a moment, as if trying to walk, then toppled. Spread out, Hawkins shouted. Keep moving. He could taste metal now, copper and rust, mixing with salt. The air above the water seemed to hum, a flat, angry whine. Tracers traced erratic lines through it, yellow and red and green. A stray shell fell behind them, close enough to lift Hawkins briefly off his feet and slam him forward. When he surfaced, coughing, he realized the blast had blown two of his men flat as well. One did not move, the other stared in shock at his own hand, or what was left of it. Bandage it later, Hawkins yelled, grabbing the wounded man by his webbing and dragging him a few feet. Head down, feet moving, they trudged. There was no sprinting in chest-deep water. Each step required lifting a foot from sucking sand and ropey strands of seaweed, then pushing forward against the drag. Hawkins' thighs burned. His lower back screamed. He welcomed the pain. It told him he was still alive. Time blurred into a series of snapshots. A shell exploding ahead, showering them with coral fragments that sliced skin like knives. A Marine lunging sideways to yank a comrade down as a burst of fire stitched the space where his head had been. The long shadow of the pier extending from the shore like a skeletal arm, its pylons blackened from near misses. Wounded men clinging to those pylons, using them as feeble cover while they bled into the lagoon. He aimed for the pier. Hug the pilings, he shouted. Use them to break the fire. By the time they reached the first wooden supports, his breath felt like it was being dragged through glass. He pressed his shoulder against a barnacle-encrusted post, closing his eyes briefly as bullets smacked into the wood inches away, jerking it in tiny spasms. Splinters peppered the side of his face. He wiped blood from his cheek with the back of his hand and blinked. The beach had grown closer, but so had the fire. He could now see individual Japanese machine gun nests gouging the sand, muzzle flashes blinking rapidly from their narrow slits. He could see mortar walking shells deliberately down the lines of stalled boats behind him, methodically turning them into floating coffins. Someone nearby said, "We are not getting off this reef, Lieutenant." He did not turn to look. He knew that if he saw the fear in that man's eyes, it would reflect his own, and he could not afford that right now. "We are getting off," he said. "We are going through them, not around them." The words came easily, almost casually. That was the trick. Say it as if the outcome were a foregone conclusion and people might believe it long enough to survive. They moved along the pier, using its length as a shield from guns firing straight down the beach. It did nothing against the ones firing from the flanks, or the shells that arced overhead and came down among them with bone-breaking concussions. Twice, Hawkins felt his feet skid out as the supports vibrated under him from near hits. Once, he had to step over a man pinned to the wood by a splinter the size of a broom handle. The Marine's eyes were cloudy, so pale they barely seemed human. At the shore end of the pier, the world turned into noise and dust. The sand just beyond the last piling was churned into bloody mud. What little cover existed twisted logs, fragments of wrecked landing craft, bodies was already occupied by men hugging it as if it were their last link to life. Hawkins leapt from the water into that chaos, stumbled, and slid on something soft. He did not want to know what it was. He rolled, came up on one knee, and found himself staring straight into a machine gun nest not 30 yards away. The bunker was squat and ugly, all angles and concrete and shadow. Muzzle flashes winked from two slits, bright and constant. The air in front of it shimmered with bullets. Hawkins could feel them pass, tiny hot wasps on his skin. He dove behind the nearest wreck, the rusting bow of a landing craft that someone had tried to ram onto the sand and abandoned when it stuck. Splinters and bullet holes riddled it. His platoon piled in behind him, gasping, some laughing that high, brittle laughter that comes after nearly dying. Kowalski landed hard at his shoulder and spat out a mouthful of sand. "Lieutenant," he said hoarsely, "they are telling everyone to fall back. Radios are saying the main line of resistance is intact. Some waves are going to circle around, land farther down the island. We are supposed to hold what we have and wait." Hawkins risked a quick glance around the edge of the wreck. What they had was maybe 10 feet of compromised sand, swept by crossfire, pounded by mortar, littered with wounded who could not move. Men were trying to dig shallow foxholes with their helmets, scooping frantically, only to watch the holes fill as fast as they could carve them. A corpsman crawled from one man to another, his white-painted helmet now half red, rummaging in his bag with fingers that shook. "Hold this," Hawkins muttered. "This is not a foothold. This is a target." He thought of the aerial photos again, the black smudges that indicated bunkers and blockhouses. On paper, the Japanese defenses looked almost abstract, neat little rectangles and circles. In front of him now, they were terribly concrete. The machine gun nest ahead was part of a cluster of 3. Together, they enfiladed the whole central stretch of the beach. Until those were knocked out, every reinforcement that came ashore here would be fed into a meat grinder. "Where are our tanks?" someone called. "Where is the armor?" Hawkins had an answer, and it was not one he liked. The tide and the reef had scattered the amphibious tractors and tanks. The few that had made it across the coral were brewing up in columns of greasy smoke as gunfire found their thinner armor. They were not coming in any coordinated wave, not anytime soon. Orders came through the radio again, crackling through static. Fall back where possible. Consolidate under the pier. Await armored support. Hawkins listened, jaw tight, then looked back at the bunker. The machine guns chattered on, and troubled by plans or hesitation. He remembered something his mother had said when he was 10 and lying in bed with both legs scalded and bandaged. The doctors had told them he might not walk again, that the damage was too severe. His mother, a small woman with calloused hands from years of work, had sat beside him and said softly, "Doctors speak for most people. You have never been most people. When they say it cannot be done, you decide if that is true." He had decided then that he would walk, even if it meant agony. The first time he tried to swing his legs over the bed, white stars had exploded in his vision and he had nearly passed out. But he had put weight on them anyway. He still remembered the smell of antiseptic and sweat and his own fear. Now he weighed that memory against the sight of Marines dying in the surf because a few machine guns were doing their job too well. "If we wait," he said quietly, mostly to himself, "more men die in the water." Kowalski heard him. "Lieutenant, those are reinforced concrete. We do not have tanks, we do not have engineers up here yet. We have rifles and grenades. You go out there, they will cut you in half before you get 20 feet. I do not need 20 feet, Hawkins said. I need 30 yards, and I need them blind for a few seconds at a time." The sergeant swore under his breath. "They told us to hold. Direct order." Hawkins felt the weight of that. Orders mattered. Discipline mattered. On Guadalcanal, he had seen what happened when men went off on their own, chasing glory. They got lost. They got killed. Sometimes they got others killed along with them. But Guadalcanal had also taught him something else. Sometimes the written plan died on contact with reality, and all that remained was the will of the man on the ground. Sometimes the person who saw what needed to be done was not the one highest in rank, but the one closest to the problem. He thought of the battalion commander, far behind, trying to make sense of fragmentary reports. That man could not see the way the bunkers overlapped their fire, how this one position in front of Hawkins was a keystone. But Hawkins could. He turned, scanning the faces around him. They were young, some so young their chins barely showed stubble, 23 men, frightened but steady. Men who had followed him into patrols in black jungle nights, trusting that he would get them out again. He saw the question in their eyes before anyone asked it. "Sir," a lance corporal said, "what are we doing?" He took a breath. The air tasted like burnt sugar and salt. "We are breaking their line," Hawkins said. "We knock out that nest, then the one beside it, then the one behind. We take away their eyes and teeth, at least right here. If we do that, the next wave has a fighting chance, and if we do not, then we watch men drown on dry sand." The lance corporal swallowed. "How?" "Sir, we have nothing heavy." Hawkins patted the canvas satchel slung across his chest. Inside, blocks of explosive nestled against metal caps. He had insisted on drawing extra charges before they loaded into the boats, arguing that a scout platoon would need them for strong points. A supply clerk had grumbled and finally relented. Now those explosives felt like both blessing and curse. "We make our own weight," Hawkins said. He began stripping down. Not weapons, he would need those, but everything not essential to staying alive for the next few minutes. Spare ammo went into Kowalski's hands. A second water canteen clunked onto the sand. He kept 3 grenades, his rifle, the satchel of explosive, and the sidearm at his hip. "Lieutenant," Kowalski said quietly, leaning close so others would not hear, "if you go, they will follow. You know that. They would rather die on your heels than lie here and watch." "Then tell them to hold," Hawkins said. "Their job is to cover, mine is to go. I am not asking for volunteers." Kowalski's jaw clenched, a muscle twitched in his cheek. "They are not going to like that. They do not have to like it. They just have to fire straight," he felt, rather than heard, the next order sweep up and down the line. Radios and shouted voices carried the words, "Hold, consolidate, do not advance." It felt like a physical thing pressing against him, a wall of caution, protocol, and reason. He stepped past it. "On my signal," he told his men, "you pour everything you have into that nest. Aim for the slits, make them duck. That is all I need. 3 seconds at a time. And you?" Kowalski asked. Hawkins looked at the bunker again. The distance seemed to stretch and shrink in his perception, sometimes 30 yards, sometimes a mile. He forced his mind back into the practical. "I stay low. I go fast. I put this under their nose." He lifted the satchel slightly, feeling the weight drag at his wounded shoulder. He had taken a glancing hit during an earlier skirmish in the Solomons. The scar tissue there protested every movement, but he ignored it. That pain went on a shelf. Silence fell in their little pocket of sand. Outside it, the battle roared. Shells crashed, men cried out. Machine guns snapped. Inside, he could hear only his own breathing and the faint clink of metal as someone checked a magazine. "Lieutenant," a private blurted suddenly, "this is crazy." Hawkins smiled, brief and thin. "You have met me before, Private." A few men chuckled, and the tension eased just enough for them to breathe. He waited for a lull, not in the fire that did not come, but in the shocks of shells nearby. When the rhythm shifted slightly, he raised his hand. Now, his men erupted. Rifles and automatic weapons barked in unison, the sound focused and furious. Bullets sparked against concrete, chewed into the lip of firing slits, snapped through the narrow windows. For a heartbeat, the machine guns inside stuttered and fell silent. Hawkins moved. He launched himself out from behind the wreck and into the open, staying low enough that his chest almost brushed the sand. He ran in a half-crouch, knees pumping, the satchel banging against his ribs. The world narrowed to a tunnel, bunker ahead, sand underfoot, air shredded by passing lead. Halfway there, the guns woke again. He felt rather than heard the shift. The pitch of the bullets changed, some whining closer, some snapping overhead. A spray of sand shot up inches to his right. Another burst kicked the dirt at his left. He zigzagged without thinking, instinct honed by months of being shot at. His boots skidded on something slick. He did not look down. A hot line seared across his upper arm. It felt like someone had drawn a brand against his skin. His hand went numb for one terrible moment, fingers loosening on the satchel. He clamped down harder and kept moving. Behind him, his men kept firing, raking the bunker's face. He heard someone shout encouragement, words indistinct but tone clear. Every second he stayed upright felt stolen from an account that would eventually run dry. The bunker grew larger, looming. At 10 yards, all he could see was featureless concrete and the black void of the firing slit. He angled left, aiming for the blind corner. Bullets ricocheted off the sand at his heels, little puffs marking near misses. He crashed against the side of the structure, chest heaving, shoulder pressed to the cold, rough surface. For a moment he simply breathed, tasting dust and fear. The firing from inside resumed at full volume, the guns now aiming past him, trying to hit the Marines who had dared to fire back. He slid along the wall, feeling for seams. The satchel felt heavier now, his arm trembling. He reached the rear of the bunker and found what he was looking for, a narrow service entrance, partially buried under sand and debris, with a wooden door reinforced with metal strips. No time to test it, no time to creep. He yanked open the satchel, fingers fumbling with the fuse. He had set charges like this before, in training, in scattered fights. This felt both routine and utterly new because this time, any error would spray his own body across the sand. He rammed the explosive at the base of the door frame, wedging it against concrete and sifted coral. Hands suddenly steadier, he fixed the blasting cap, yanked the fuse cord, and heard it begin to hiss. "Please do not misfire," he muttered under his breath. He threw himself flat, arms over his head. The blast slammed into him like a physical blow. A deep, gut punch sound echoed through his body as the bunker shuddered. Sand and debris rained down, peppering his helmet. He tasted blood as his teeth clipped his tongue. He was on his feet before the echo fully faded. Smoke poured from the doorway, acrid and thick. He shoved through it, coughing, eyes burning. Inside, the world shrank to a cramped space lit by flickering orange from small fires. Shadows moved. A figure staggered in front of him, uniform smeared with soot, eyes wide. Hawkins fired reflexively. The Japanese soldier jerked and fell backward onto the still spinning barrel of the machine gun. Another figure lunged from the side, bayonet glinting. Hawkins twisted, feeling the blade slice his sleeve. He jammed his rifle forward, but first, cracking the attacker in the jaw. Teeth and blood flew. A second shot ended it. When the smoke cleared enough to see, the interior of the bunker resembled a smashed furnace. The gun, a heavy automatic weapon that had just been chewing through flesh, now lay crooked, its mount bent. 2 more bodies slumped in corners still. He backed out, chest heaving, and nearly collided with Kowalski, who had sprinted up while the others laid down covering fire. "Crazy son of a," the sergeant panted. "You did it." "Not yet," Hawkins said, nodding toward the next nest. "That one will be awake now." They saw their friend go quiet. The second bunker's machine gun had paused during the blast, then redoubled its fire, sweeping back and forth. Hawkins knew they would be adjusting, searching for the source of the explosion. He had lost the element of surprise. What he had gained was a crack in the line, he assessed quickly. The second nest was positioned slightly higher, with a better view down the beach. Its walls looked thicker, reinforced with angled logs and sandbags in addition to concrete. The simple satchel trick might not work as cleanly. "Lieutenant," Kowalski said, "you are hit." Hawkins looked down, as if noticing for the first time the warm wetness soaking his sleeve. Blood dripped from his fingertip. The line across his arm that had felt like fire now throbbed. "Grazed," he said. "If it were bad, I would feel less. That is not how bodies work," Kowalski muttered. "Today it is," Hawkins replied. "Listen. That big casemate back there," he pointed beyond the bunkers to where a heavier structure loomed, "is the real bastard. 75 millimeter, maybe bigger. When that thing wakes fully, it will shred anything that makes it onto this beach. These little guns are its eyes. We blind it, sir. That is 3 concrete positions in the space of." The sergeant glanced at his watch. 10 minutes. "You are not a one-man army." "Good thing," Hawkins said. "I am not alone." He turned back to the wreck where his men crouched. Their faces had changed. The terror was still there, but now it was shot through with something else. Maybe, or the dangerous relief that comes when an impossible task suddenly seems just barely possible. You saw it, he shouted. Concrete does not mean invincible. That nest is gone. Next one is harder, but the principle is the same. We move while they are thinking, not while they are ready. A hand went up. Sir, are we disobeying orders? The question hung between them. He thought of the battalion net, of voices he respected telling him to hold. He thought of young officers on other parts of the beach obeying that, hunkering down, hoping someone else would solve the problem. I am obeying the spirit, Hawkins said finally. Our orders are to take this beach. We cannot do that lying here. I am going. You are covering. That is not disobedience. That is initiative. He did not know if anyone in headquarters would agree. He suspected, dimly, that if he survived this, he might have to answer for it, but that was a later shelf. He reloaded, fingers moving almost on muscle memory, and prepared to run the gauntlet again. This time, the Japanese were ready. He barely cleared the relative safety of the wreck before a burst dug a line at his feet, spraying sand into his face. He threw himself sideways, rolling behind a low hump of earth that might have once been a dune. Bullets smacked into it, showering him with grit. Splinters of something wood, bone, stone cut his cheek. His men responded instantly, firing so hard that barrels began to smoke. The noise was overwhelming, a layered roar that flattened thought. He pressed closer to the earth, trying to make himself as small as possible, and crawled. The new path was uglier. There were more bodies here, some tangled together, some half buried in shell holes. He pushed around and over them, apologizing under his breath when his knee inadvertently pressed into a limp hand or chest. In the back of his mind, a voice whispered the question he had been fending off since they left the ship. How many of these men could have lived if someone had done this earlier? He bit down on it. That way lay paralysis. When he reached the side of the second bunker, he found no convenient door. Just a solid wall of concrete and sandbag reinforcement. Of course, he whispered, almost admiringly. These positions had been built by men who knew their trade. He could feel the vibration of the gun inside through the wall. It rattled his teeth. Time for more direct measures. He pulled a grenade from his belt, one of the pineapple-shaped fragmentation ones, and rolled his shoulders experimentally. His wounded arm complained. He ignored it and inched along, until he could see the edge of a firing slit. The opening glared back at him like a black eye. A steady stream of fire spat from it. He waited, counting heartbeats, looking for the rhythm. Every gunner, no matter how disciplined, had to pause to reload, to shift position, to wipe sweat from his hands. There, the staccato cut off for a breath. He popped up, arm already extended, and whipped the grenade toward the opening. For a horrible instant, it seemed to low. Then the little oval silhouette vanished into the darkness. He ducked before the explosion. Even muffled by concrete, it was concussive enough to make his ears ring. Smoke and dust belched from the slit. He did not wait. He sawed the second grenade's pin free and shoved it into one of the auxiliary openings, then scrambled back as far as he could. This blast punched a chunk out of the sandbag wall, sending fabric and sand in all directions. He used that gap, hurling himself into the jagged opening. Inside, stunt shapes moved sluggishly. He took no chances. His rifle cracked twice. A figure lunged, bayonet flashing. He twisted, felt metal glance off his web gear, and drove his own bayonet forward. They collided chest to chest before the other man sagged. He had a fleeting impression of photographs pinned to a concrete wall, images of mountains, a family perhaps, brittle paper now coated in dust, and then Kowalski's voice shouted his name from outside. Lieutenant, that big gun is moving. Hawkins staggered back into the daylight, lungs burning. He followed the direction of the sergeant's pointing arm. The heavy casemate, the one that hunched like a squat dragon farther up the beach, was waking. Its barrel, thick and brutal, traversed slowly. It lined up along the pier for a moment, then shifted toward the cluster of survivors taking cover there. If it fired, men who thought themselves relatively safe would suddenly find death dropping among them in 100-pound shells. He could not reach that casemate the same way. It sat behind multiple layers of wire and obstacles, but there was one angle. An amphibious tractor lay half-wrecked near its flank, track blown off, hull blackened. Its bulk provided something he had not had since stepping off the boat: partial, mobile cover. He sprinted toward it, legs threatening mutiny. Bullets clanged against its metal side. One found his shoulder, this time flush. The impact spun him half around. For a second, his body refused to respond. He tasted copper again, then realized it was his own blood. Warmth rushed down his chest under the blouse. His left arm went leaden. The world wanted to tilt, dim, pull him under. He grabbed the tractor's side with his functioning hand and hauled himself up the slanted hull. "Lieutenant!" Kowalski screamed behind him. "You are hit. Get down." He could not afford to listen. If he stopped now, that gun would fire. If it fired, dozens of men would be erased in a heartbeat. The math was simple: his life for theirs. A trade he found, in that moment, entirely acceptable. It was an odd clarity. Pain receded slightly, pushed aside by something harder. He crawled on hands and knees to the highest point of the wreck. From there, he had a direct view into the casemate's main opening. He saw Japanese sailors inside, uniforms stained, faces set. One stood at the breech of the gun, shoving a shell into its maw. Another yelled something and pointed in Hawkins' direction. Their eyes met, a bare instant of shared recognition that both were now fighting on the edge. Hawkins reached for the last two grenades on his belt. His fingers closed on one. The other fell, clattering down the hull. He ignored it. Pull, throw, duck. The movement had been practiced so many times his body could do it without full coordination. He yanked the pin with his teeth, ignoring the sting as metal scraped gums, and lobbed the grenade through the casemate opening with a motion that nearly tore his shoulder apart. He did not bother to see if it landed well. He rolled awkwardly down the far side of the tractor, body protesting every jolt. The explosion that followed was deeper, angrier than the others. It jumped the air. For a moment, the gun's barrel spat smoke instead of fire, then sagged. He lay there, pressed between metal and sand, listening to his own ragged breathing. The sounds of the wider battle seeped back in slowly, like a tide. "Sir," a voice above him, thin, trembling. "Lieutenant Hawkins," he tried to answer and found his mouth full of grit. He spat, coughed, and tasted more blood. "I am here," he managed. A face appeared over the lip of the wreck, grime-streaked. It was the young Marine who had earlier called the plan crazy. "You did it," the man said, half laughing, half sobbing. "Those guns, they are quiet. They are. They are actually quiet." For a moment, Hawkins considered making a joke. Something about the importance of noise discipline. The words did not come. His throat felt thick. His chest hurt with each breath, not just from exertion but from something deeper. He looked down and saw that the blood soaking his uniform was darker now, thicker, spreading from more than one wound. "Good," he said simply. "Then you keep moving. Do not stop on that sand for anything except a direct hit." "We cannot leave you," the Marine protested. "You can," Hawkins said. "You will. That gun stays silent. The next wave gets in. That is what matters." Kowalski appeared beside the younger man, panting, eyes wide with horror as he took in the amount of red covering his lieutenant. "Doc," he shouted over his shoulder. "Corpsman." A figure in a stained white helmet scrambled up, medkit banging against his side. He slid to his knees beside Hawkins and ripped open the blouse without ceremony. The air hit burned skin. Hawkins hissed. "2 hits at least," the corpsman said tightly. "Maybe 3. Lungs, maybe. I have to get you back." "No," Hawkins rasped. Talking felt like dragging words through mud. "No back. There." He lifted his working hand to point not at himself but at the beach. Marines were moving now. Not all, not even most yet, but enough. With the machine guns and the big casemate silent, the killing zones had fractured. Men dashed from crater to wreck to shallow scrape, leapfrogging forward in little knots. Some were his scouts, others from assault companies, all seizing the moment. "See," Hawkins said, his vision tunneling at the edges. "Through, not around." Kowalski's face twisted. "We need you. You cannot check out now, sir. We have more of this island to clear. I have done my—" Hawkins' breath hitched. "My part." Memories flickered strangely through his head, his mother's hands massaging his ruined legs, the dusty streets of El Paso, the feel of textbooks under his arm at the Texas College of Mines. The first time a drill instructor had called him Marine instead of maggot, he saw the jungle of Guadalcanal, shadows full of eyes. He saw the faces of men who had not made it off that island, and the faces of the ones who had, because someone had gone back for them. It seemed unfair, briefly, that his story might end here, on a strip of sand so small that most of the world could not find it on a map. Then he thought of what this strip represented: a stepping stone, an airfield. A place from which bombers could leapfrog deeper into the Pacific, hitting atolls and islands whose names no one back home could pronounce. It was ugly, but it was necessary. He felt a strange lightness, as if some weight he had been carrying since boarding the ship had finally slipped. He had been terrified, he realized. Not of dying, though there was fear in that too, but of failing, of freezing, of being the one who hesitated while others pushed forward. That had haunted him from the day he had first put on the gold bar of an officer. Men had saluted him, and with every salute came the silent question, "Are you worthy of this?" He did not know if he had fully answered it. That was for others to say. But he had done what he could with the time and strength given. That would have to be enough. "Tell," he began, then had to cough, pain flaring. "Tell my mother I tried." "You will tell her yourself," the corpsman said fiercely, slapping a bandage over one of the wounds. "We are going to get you to a boat. We have morphine. We have—" The words floated away. Sound itself seemed to recede, like waves drawing back from a shore. For a second, there was only the smell of cordite and ocean, and the faintest hint of his mother's perfume, which he had not smelled in years. He felt, distantly, hands trying to lift him. The movement jarred something inside that sent a bolt of agony through his chest. He might have cried out. He might not. He could not tell. Light flickered. The sky above was a hard, bright blue, cut by black smoke columns. A tiny seabird wheeled overhead, absurdly delicate amidst the carnage. He focused on it, letting the image imprint itself in his mind as everything else blurred. Then there was nothing at all. Years later, historians would slice and reassemble the Battle of Tarawa into pages and diagrams, mapping every company's path across the island, every bunker reduced, every casualty tallied. They would argue about strategy, about whether the island had been worth the cost, about whether different tides or better intelligence could have lowered the butcher's bill. They would write about admirals' boasts of 100-year defense shattered in just over 3 days. They would note that this tiny atoll, barely a smear of land on the vast Pacific, had taught the United States how brutally difficult fortified amphibious landings would be and had forced changes that saved lives on Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. In the margins of those histories, one name would appear with particular emphasis: William Dean Hawkins. Accounts from men who had been there would strain to capture what it had felt like to watch a single man move forward when everyone else was being told to stay put. Some would say he fought like he did not care whether he lived or died. Others, who had known him well, would correct that. He cared deeply. He just cared more about the men behind him than about the future he was sacrificing. His mother would stand in a quiet room far from any ocean, listening as a citation was read that tried to compress into a few paragraphs the chaotic, bloody, desperate minutes on that reef and beach. She would take the metal with steady hands, eyes dry, not because she did not grieve, but because she had long ago resolved not to let the world see her break. Marines who had survived Bedio would meet in dim halls and sunlit living rooms in the decades that followed, sharing coffee and stories. When the conversation turned to Tarawa, as it often did, someone would inevitably mention that crazy Texan lieutenant who had charged the pillboxes alone. Voices would soften, heads would shake with rueful admiration. In those moments, the coral and the surf and the stuttering guns would come back sharp as yesterday. On Bedio itself, nature would set about reclaiming what men had carved. Coral would grow over rusting metal, vines would creep along spalling concrete. Children of a new generation would scramble over old bunkers, their shrieks of play echoing where once men screamed in pain. Tourists, if any came, would pause at plaques and weathered markers, their eyes skimming names and dates without fully grasping the weight each carried. But memory has a way of persisting, stubborn and quiet. Even where the tide has washed away boot prints, even where palmettos have pierced old trenches, there remains the knowledge that on a November morning, when caution and order said wait, one man stepped forward into a sea of fire because he believed that every minute stolen from the enemy's guns was a minute given to the lives of men he would never even meet. His charge through the reef did not win the war. It did not even win the battle on its own. Battles are seldom decided by a single act. Yet such acts are the sparks that turn the tinder of collective effort into something fierce enough to break lines that were supposed to be unbreakable. For those who care about such stories, about the individuals inside the grand sweep of history, there is a simple way to honor them: share their tales, speak their names, pass them on so that the next generation understands that behind every line in a history book lies a human being who made a choice when it mattered. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the countless others like Hawkins whose names are less known, whose graves are unvisited, whose letters home lay unread in attics and archives. Consider sharing this with someone who loves the history of that war, or with someone who might not yet realize how much of their present was bought on beaches and reefs half a world away. Leave a note about where you are in the world, or about relatives who served, so that their service can sit beside his in the long memory of those who care. And if you wish to keep these histories alive, to hear more about the battles, the innovations, and above all the people who fought through that global storm, make sure you stay connected, support the telling of such tales, and help ensure that the courage shown on places like Tarawa is never reduced to just a footnote, but remains a living, breathing part of our shared story. A single charge through hell can change a battle, but only if the story survives. So if this one hit you, take a breath, drop a like, share it with someone who loves World War II history. Leave a comment about where you are watching from or who in your family served, and subscribe to keep these forgotten heroes walking among us a little longer.